Good morning, everybody, both in this room and to the many people who are online. Welcome to this event that ACA is co-organizing with our four member agencies who have offices in Brussels and are co-organizing this event with us. The DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, the Norwegian Directorate for Higher Education and Skills, VLUR, the Flemish Higher Education Council, and the Czech National Agency for International Education and Research, Czech Liaison Office for Education and Research in Brussels, in short, DZS-CELO. This is the first ACA event in 18 months that is not only virtual. In fact, we were planning a similar event at the very day of the lockdown last year. And it's also the first ever hybrid event, and I hope it will work well. COVID has been a shock and an unprecedented crisis also in our field. It has spotlighted strengths and weaknesses of higher education institutions, policymakers, and funding agencies like ACA's 16 member organizations across Europe. It has also been an enormous accelerator for changes, many of which were probably due well before the pandemic. The crisis has highlighted the vulnerability of established practices, but it has also shown the resilience and adaptability of institutions. The crisis had brought much international and intra-European mobility to a sudden standstill, but it has also demonstrated how much students and faculty crave for personal interaction and international experience. Finally, the COVID crisis has shown the delays in the use of modern technology by higher education institutions and in international cooperation, and it has given a huge boost to its use in everyday teaching and research and in international cooperation. We have suffered from and through this crisis, but I think we are now more mature and better prepared for new challenges that are sure to come, even if we don't know what they will be. It is very timely that the European Commission has taken the initiative right now to launch a discussion on the future of the European higher education area and the European research area, and to develop an integrated European strategy for universities. This is timely the more so that we've just seen the launch of the new generation of the Erasmus Plus program, of Horizon Europe, and the development of the European University Initiative. Institutional, national, European, and global perspectives are more interlinked in higher education than ever before. No serious institution can define its strategy on a purely local or national basis. And no European strategy will work if it is not based on the input and practice of individual institutions and national agencies. International education and cross-border cooperation have been a driver for reform and innovation in the past, and they will be in the future. Let me just remind all of us of the Bologna process that started as a European initiative and then changed so fundamentally the practice of teaching and learning in higher education institutions, even beyond Europe. And let me remind all of us of the Erasmus program that has so fundamentally affected the very mindset, not only of students, but also of faculty and of higher education institutions. International cooperation contributes thus to objectives that may at first seem primarily institutional or domestic, like more inclusion, better digitization, and more sustainability. Of course, these objectives also need to be achieved in and with international education and exchange itself. Today, our focus is on mobility, although we are aware that internationalization is not just that. And the focus is on the three pillars on which much of the European strategy for universities, as well as the new generation of Erasmus Plus, must rest. I said pillars, that is, structures to support a roof, and not separate silos, as is much too often the case in our discussions and in our daily practice. We have just set out our position in a position paper that has been published yesterday and is now available on the online platform for this event. I will not reiterate what's in it, as you are all pretty literate, and as we will hear more concrete examples this morning. Let me just point out three core messages. We need to place transnational cooperation at the very core of the European strategy and make full use of its innovative potential as a motor for reform and meaningful change. We need to create a comprehensive framework within built and in depth synergies and a program designed to support such synergies. And finally, we need to foster a more strategic and regular use of data on international education to support evidence-based policies and program designs. The goal of today's event is twofold. On one hand, we wish to showcase some good practice examples from the work of our member organizations that contribute meaningfully to policy and program developments at European as well as institutional levels. And second, we wish to contribute to a policy debate on how to actually balance different objectives and develop a comprehensive approach to mobility that must be inclusive, digital, and sustainable at the same time. In a perfect world, internationalization, digitization, sustainability, and inclusion would all fit together like hand in glove. They don't. The world isn't perfect. Given that longer stays abroad have so far been more difficult to access for students from less privileged backgrounds, the point is frequently made that shorter stays abroad would be more inclusive. That may be the case, but shorter travel by more people would also cause a bigger carbon footprint. How can we achieve more equity and inclusiveness and yet be more sustainable than we've been in the past? More digital interaction is supposed to be a way out of this, as of many other, if not all, dilemmas. But is it? Have actually all students in all parts of Europe, not to speak of all parts of the world, equal access to appropriate hard and software and fast internet access? Have all institutions across the continent the same resources to develop their online capabilities rather than depend on wealthier institutions and commercial providers? We do not yet have all the answers to such questions, but we will need to find them, both for a European strategy for universities and for internationalization efforts of individual institutions and funding agencies. If this event helps to make the next step in this direction, it will have served its purpose. I wish us all a lively and constructive event, both in this room and online. Thank you for your attention, and I would now like to pass the floor, without further ado, to Irina to launch our first panel. Thank you.
Warm thanks, ACA President, for this comprehensive introduction, setting the ground for our conversations today. And indeed, now we move to our first roundtable discussion under the broader questions of why and how to marry the inclusion, sustainability, and digital agendas in and through mobility. We've convened for this purpose around our partly virtual and partly physical roundtable, no less than 6 distinguished colleagues that will help us explore these questions and contribute with their insights from policy, program, and implementation-related perspectives, connecting the dots between the European, the national, and the institutional level realities. As we have much ground to cover in this first roundtable together, allow me to briefly introduce them to you by their current roles, while inviting you to read their more detailed biographies online and learn of their many previous achievements. And I will start with the 2 European Commission colleagues joining us today after a long time again. And we have first online the well-known Vanessa Debiais-Sainton, working as head of unit for higher education in the Directorate General for Education and Culture, European Commission, joined by Filip van Depoele, to my left here on site, Vanessa's counterpart and head of unit for international cooperation in DG EAC, European Commission as well. Welcome to you both. We're very glad to have you with us today. We move next to 2 representatives of national level internationalization funding agencies, and importantly for us, ACA members. And online we have Jakub, Tesar, and Vidar Pedersen. Jakub is working as higher education, leading the higher education department at DZS, the Czech National Agency for International Education and Research, whereas Vidar works as European Program Director at the Norwegian Directorate for Higher Education and Skills. Vidar is also the Director of the National Agency for Erasmus Plus in Norway. Fifth, we have with us here on site a student voice impersonated by the recently elected president of the Erasmus Student Network, Juan Rayon Gonzalez. Warm thanks for joining us as well, Juan Rayon. And online, we have as well an institutional voice of our panel, Jan Palmowski, Secretary General of the Guild of European Research Intensive Universities, the Guild. Wonderful to see you, Jan, as well, and thank you for joining us. We'll start the conversations in the roundtable with the first round of questions to our panelists, while warmly encouraging those of you joining us online to pose your questions through the dedicated comments section of the platform. And for those of you who we're lucky to have here on site, we'll have also some dedicated time later on for live questions. So let's start the exchange, and I'll do that with a first question to you, Vanessa, in fact, because in many respects, as our president mentioned already, our internal reflections on this question of synergies and potential tensions between the wider policy objectives, particularly in international student mobility, but not only, were actually sparked by our input towards the development of the broader European strategy for universities. So in that context, I'd like to start with inviting you first to provide us with a brief update on where we are with the strategy development, as well as to reflect a bit on this question of synergies and how they might be addressed, the synergies between the different pillars of the strategy and how they might be addressed within the framework of the strategy. Last point related to this, maybe a few words on the European University Initiative as we start, and the question of synergies as well. The floor is yours.
So we will continue supporting the European universities through a more sustainable funding, including through new Erasmus Plus course coming this autumn. And we aim at removing some of their most pressing hurdles for their deeper cooperation with the Council recommendation that we aim at presenting early next year together with the strategy. So this is in a nutshell what I could say now, Irina.
So many thanks for these introductory words and for the reminder of how the European Commission sees higher education institutions at the heart of these transformations and the recovery in Europe, and also for explaining us the broader vision of this strategy and connecting both the research and the education dimension of previous communications. Now I'd like to turn to Filip for a similar question, but obviously from the perspective of the international dimension of the European programs in Erasmus Plus in particular. And with a link to the European strategy for universities, Filip, one of the main pillars is called at the moment Global Europe, reflecting on the international dimension. So how do you see from your role this question of synergies and how they can be fostered through the international dimension of the program, and particularly through cooperation and mobility with partner countries?
Okay, hi, good morning everybody, and first of all, just saying how happy I am to be in a physical event again and to see real people attending, so I think it's nice, and hopefully we'll get more of this in the future. But just on your question, thanks a lot. I think it's a very important point to look at, and I think also a very timely discussion now that, as we have heard from Vanessa, you're really pondering on the European strategy for universities. But I think it's maybe better to first take a step back and to think about when the von der Leyen Commission came into office. And basically, as we all know, they had very clear priorities with the green and the digital transition. But then, we have heard it, we had the COVID crisis, and I think there was a real risk that green and digital would be put on the back burner. But actually, exactly the opposite happened. And the Commission made it very clear that in order to get out of the crisis, we need to invest more and focus even more on the green and digital transition. And I think that's how at least I have seen it within the Commission. I think that this kind of consistent policy approach is clearly having a real impact. If we just take an example, if you look at Horizon Europe, it is clear that green and digital are underpinning the new program. We haven't mentioned yet the European education area, but I think if you look at the communication of September of last year, very clearly inclusion, green and digital are a bit of the fundamental priorities or the dimensions, the main dimensions of what we want to achieve with the European education area. And as Vanessa also mentioned, green and digital and inclusion will be important building blocks of the European strategy for universities. And I would like to say that just as universities tend to gain a lot from mobility and cooperation beyond EU borders, there will also be what we call, and you refer to it, a global Europe building block as part of the overall strategy, the strategy for universities that will come at the beginning of next year. And I think that we all agree that boosting high quality international cooperation in higher education is essential to address societal challenges, but also to support Europe's competitiveness and to make sure that we remain attractive and are able to retain and attract talent and know-how. And that's also why we have to ensure that when it comes to international cooperation, we need to ensure that it's both green and digital, and that also we strive to have it as inclusive as possible. And as Vanessa already touched a bit upon the policy aspects, I think I would like to dwell a bit on what it means in concrete terms looking at the Erasmus Plus program. Because in fact, when we announced the Erasmus Plus program, the new one for the 2021-2027 period, we really presented it as a more inclusive, a greener and a more digital program. And these are precisely the topics of our discussion today. And I think if you talk about green, digital and more inclusive, this also applies to the international dimension of the program. So you know that the program overall will almost see a doubling of its budget. It will also see a stronger international dimension with in total 2.2 billion euros that we are receiving from the external cooperation instruments to reinforce the international dimension of the Erasmus Plus program. And I think I would like maybe to give a few concrete examples on how you're trying to tackle those three priorities. Maybe first when we talk about inclusion, if we look at, I think you're all familiar with the International Credit Mobility Action, what are we going to do to make it more inclusive? One of the elements is to allow for shorter mobility periods. So we would allow for mobility periods as of 5 to 30 days, which would allow it for people who otherwise would not be able to participate to take part in the program. Similarly, we are investing quite a lot and putting quite a lot of emphasis on blended mobility, where again, people with fewer opportunities might not have had the opportunity before, but thanks to those blended opportunities, they might now be able to participate. We are adding additional financial support for individuals with fewer opportunities. We are providing guidance to national agencies on how to promote the program with new players, with smaller higher education institutions for which it was so far not possible to participate. We are strengthening the social inclusion aspects in the inter-institutional agreement between the institutions in Europe and their partners beyond Europe. And I think also as a very concrete measure, we are increasing what we call the organizational support. So the funding that we give to institutions to manage the mobilities, we're increasing it when it comes to the international credit mobility from 350 to 500 euros. And one of the main reasons behind it is that that would allow institutions to help people to be mobile, to support, for example, with visa fees, if that were to be the case. And eventually, I think our intention is also to come up with a specific costing for visa costs, because we can see that, particularly from participants from third countries, it can be extremely expensive and a bit of a barrier or a hurdle to participate in the program. So that's also something we will try to tackle. And we also have indicative targets when it comes to the participation of people with fewer opportunities that we would like to achieve throughout the lifetime of the program. So there's a bit of the how we tackle inclusion under the mobility, International Credit Mobility Action. But I think it's equally important to have an inclusive approach when we talk about capacity building for higher education. And then I think a big novelty, I'm very happy that this is happening, is that we are now coming up with a new strand of the capacity building action, a specific strand for newcomers, focusing on institutions which have not been participating so far, focusing on countries or regions which have been underrepresented, and also on projects which have a very strong focus on reaching out to both staff and students with fewer opportunities. So there's a specific action designed with this goal in mind. And I think it's also interesting because we keep capacity building higher education bottom up when it comes to the topics or the areas to be worked on. But regardless, or even with this, despite this kind of very open agenda, we have seen that in the previous program, a lot of cooperation projects were actually dealing about green, digital or inclusive aspects. So we are very confident that this will continue to be the case in the future. Maybe just one word on the green dimension when we look at the program. There, one of the elements we are coming up with, and I think it's across the board, but also for the international component, is top-ups for green travel. It's obviously a bit of a challenge when you go further afield, but still there we believe that mobilities towards, for example, Western Balkans, towards the Eastern Partnership countries or the South Med, there we can, thanks to this top-up, give more incentives for both staff and students to use more sustainable ways of transportation. And we're also working on a paperless Erasmus Plus with digital means that would simplify the administrative procedures. And maybe then finally, to just close off, a word on the digital dimension. I already mentioned it, we cater for blended mobilities. We see this as a nice mean to combine inclusion and digital. You know that there will also be blended intensive programs where we will fund participants from third countries to come to participating countries to take part in those blended intensive programs. As I said, there will be the gradual digitalization of all administrative steps, also for the international cooperation, so we're there building on the steps that are already taken for the intra-EU mobility. And I think something which we found very interesting and very positive was the pilot project on Erasmus virtual exchanges, where we're putting young people, higher education students, but also people outside of higher education, from Erasmus Plus participating countries in touch with young people from the South Med. This has proven to be a very effective means to stimulate intercultural dialogue. And now we are expanding this. It will become a fully fledged action of the new program. We are expanding it geographically. So it used to be with the South Med, so now it will be expanded to the Eastern Partnership countries and equally to the Western Balkans. So just to conclude it, throughout the program, green, digital, and inclusion are the main priorities. This is equally the case for the international dimension. But I think that the point of this discussion is a very relevant one. We have to make sure that we don't look at them in silos, that we have to look at how they interact, that there can, in the best case, be synergetic, but that in any case, they should not contradict each other. And that if we work on digital, it shouldn't be at the expense of inclusiveness, or if we look at inclusiveness, that it isn't at the cost of sustainability. And I think, I mean, just to give an example, blended mobility, we see this as a nice combination because it can allow people who have not been able to participate to take part. It is using digital tools to complement the physical mobility. And when it comes to the physical mobility, hopefully let's see, but we are pushing towards the use of more sustainable means of transportation. So I think there can be nice examples where we can try to achieve the three objectives through one single action. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well, Filip, for these reflections and confirmations in many respects of the importance of these objectives, also for the international part of the program, and also of your current reflections on another dimension of synergies, in a sense, right? Because we've been discussing, I think, synergies between different funding programs, synergies between different policies for quite a number of years, together with the European Commission, and also from our side as a network, we hope to really make a contribution with further calling for this discussion and reflection or synergies also between the different objectives. And just as a side note, we carried out a flash survey in preparation of this event, and we got, I think, some 50 responses for higher education institutions in Europe. So a small sample, you could say, nonetheless quite indicative that this question of synergies is already being reflected on and discussed within higher education institutions in Europe, and that many of them are thinking of how to reconcile the links and also potential tensions, particularly within strategies, internationalization strategies or wider institutional strategies. So 70% of those that responded reflected on that. Interesting to hear that the international dimension of the program is going to be reinforced also through this strategy as a network. That is something we warmly welcome. And particularly this work on promoting Europe more jointly as a study and research destination. And we have a number of reflections in our position paper on that front. I'm looking also at the platform, and I understand, unfortunately, quite a number of colleagues missed Vanessa's input. And there are some kind requests to summarize. I can't promise to do justice to the comprehensive insights that Vanessa shared, but I will perhaps just say a few key words on the developments of the European strategy for universities. As many of you might know or not, the work towards this strategy started beginning of this year, and the strategy was initially referenced, I think, also in the European education area communication as the higher education transformation agenda. Exactly. The consultation process started very broadly, I would say, from the European Commission side, beginning of this year, through various channels, including a stakeholder group consultation, bringing together representatives of different networks, European universities alliances, student representatives, and so on. And we ourselves as ACA have been contributing to the stakeholder group consultations. I think Vanessa highlighted how the thinking towards the European strategy for universities, trying to link different communications that have been issued by the European Commission, guided by the wider priorities of the von der Leyen Commission, of course. Key, I think, in this area are the European education area communication, the European research area communication, and also the digital education action plan of last year. I think consultations are still ongoing. We ourselves had a meeting together with other networks last week with Commissioner Maria Gabriel sharing some of our insights and views towards this strategy. So I allow myself to invite you to further comment or to further provide input for the development of the strategy via different channels, position papers, statements, and so on. And the timeline, as Vanessa shared it just previously, is that the strategy will be officially launched, Filip, that's correct, right, beginning of next year. We'll have the recording available afterwards, so you will be able to catch Vanessa's points in full. So apologies again for the technical challenges, and we hope we'll be able to proceed smoothly also with our other online speakers. Now turning to, well, the other four gentlemen, apart from Filip in this panel, with another comprehensive question. Apologies for that. But what I want to ask you now, having heard this input from the European Commission colleagues, is how these new policy objectives of more inclusive, sustainable, greener, and digitally enhanced mobility are actually impacting your work, reckoning that you represent different types of organizations. So we have internationalization funding agencies, university networks, and also student organizations. And related to that, so what is the impact so far? What changes do you already see within your specific work in the different organizations? And also, what do you think you would like to bring forward from these transformations you might already be experiencing for these policy developments at European level? So what could be basically upscaled? I'd like to give the floor now to Vidar to start us with this broader question. And let's see, hopefully we don't have the technical problems anymore for online connections. Let's test.
Well, thank you, Irina, and thanks for the invitation. You asked about what effects do we already see and experience, and I think one obvious one is that I'm actually sitting in my home right now, participating in this conference and not being in Brussels as I would otherwise have been. I mean, that is a very concrete and tangible effect that I think everyone has experienced. When that is said and done, I should also say I'm not quite sure how strategic or forward-looking we, or for that matter, higher education institutions are. We're still, I think everyone is still, coping with the unknown, coping and navigating an unexpected situation. So that should also be a backdrop here. And we are, coping as we go along, facilitating new arrangements. Using new solutions all the time. But I would also say that for the agency, I mean, we're a newly merged agency. We are a funding agency. We're the Erasmus Plus national agency, but we also administer a number of national incentive measures for international and national cooperation. We were established on July 1st. But of course there was a predecessor, or there were many predecessors to this organization, one of them being DICU, which has been an ACA member for many years, and which is also where I come from. DICU developed a new strategy in 2018, which of course is no longer a strategy of the new agency, but the priorities are still there. And I just mentioned a few of them to show the direction we were moving in then, some of the priorities there, one of them being that the UN Sustainable Development Goals shall impact on the content and organization of all our programs and measures. We should encourage Norwegian institutions and individuals to take part in the Erasmus Plus program as a means to promote green innovation and digital innovation and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And above all, we are supposed to reduce the organization's climate footprint, which I think I'm contributing as I speak, basically. Now, I should say the implementation of these are still ongoing. But let's turn to the sector and to the question of mobility and international cooperation. The question is how to marry these three agendas of sustainability, inclusion, and the greener programs, and I think there are, of course, tensions here. Looking at one of the major documents that guide our work now is a white paper coming from the government in the second half of 2020, in November or October last year it was released, a white paper called The World of Opportunities on International Student Mobility, where the goal is stated quite clearly that we should have at least 50% of our students, or at least 50% of our students should have an international mobility experience when they graduate. We're currently at less than 20. So that is an encouragement to physical mobility, of course, and I think we can all see the possible tensions with a greener and more sustainable world by sending more students abroad. However, the paper also says that we should send more students to Europe, or a larger share of our student mobility should go to Europe, which means shorter travel, and that, of course, is a lot more environmentally sustainable than if you send all your students to Australia, New Zealand, or South America, for that matter. Now, we shouldn't forget the international and global dimension, but more mobility should go to Europe. We also see some changing practice in many programs. We see that, for instance, in the Erasmus Plus Strategic Partnership Cooperation, the applications that we're assessing right now, we see that digital cooperation, online meetings, virtual mobility are becoming much more of a standard activity, much more of the staple diet of international cooperation, which is possible. Not that mobility is gone, but it's there as a supplement to mobility, and in some cases also replacing the physical mobility. And we also see in national programs that physical, particularly staff mobility, virtual mobility complements, and in some cases also replaces some of the physical mobility that would take place. However, physical mobility is still important, and as our minister said concerning student mobility, if there is one international trip that you will undertake, this is the one. The study trip abroad is the one that's really important. Rather skip some of your other vacation plans, but this is really important for development. And we see this. I mean, physical mobility is necessary to give students the learning outcomes necessary to cope in a modern world. Personal development, solving skills, collaborative tolerance, intercultural competence, all of these are important. So making students in the future adjust to an unfamiliar context, we certainly need to equip them with these skills in the future. However, I think it's also important to note that in order to justify physical mobility, it needs to be of high quality. We must make sure that the learning outcome is there. We must make sure that they travel within arrangements that secure recognition. And we also see that in the development, at least in our national programs, I think also in the Erasmus program, is towards mobility within partnerships. We see that institutional collaboration through partnerships, long-term defined partnerships, as we see, for instance, in the European Universities Initiative, are important and will also then increase the quality of student mobility because they take place within a more overarching and strategic framework than simply the free move of mobility that perhaps was dominant in the past. And this is not something which is brand new because of these new agendas. This is a development, I think, that has been going on for a long time, but now also motivated more by the digital and sustainable agendas. We also see now that application numbers, for instance, for blended intensive programs in the new Erasmus program are high. So yes, the sector is definitely adapting to this new call it framework and the new priorities of the Commission, and we see that this is not on the back burner at all, as Filip said, one feared it would be, but it's rather really at the forefront of priorities of universities and also of our agencies. So we look forward to seeing what kind of international collaboration will dominate in the future, but we still think that physical mobility will remain and should remain as one important element among a number of other supplementing elements of international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidar, for these very interesting insights as well from the Norwegian context. Many points, I think, that resonate with the conversations in many of our ACA member organizations at the moment, so national level agencies. I will reiterate perhaps just a point you've made about the importance of safeguarding physical mobility while still embarking on these broader transformations toward more digitally enhanced and sustainable, inclusive formats. And I found it quite important what you've said about the safeguarding the quality of these mobilities. So being more intentional in a sense and more impactful, knowing what are the other side effects of these mobilities, particularly on the environment, and how strategic collaborations in general, and we see wider trends towards these developments, are a tool, are a way to deliver on the better quality mobility opportunities overall. Before inviting the others to take the floor, I also wanted to share that again from our flash survey that we carried recently. We also noticed that higher education institutions, or so the ones that responded have said, are turning for these questions on synergies between objectives and potential tensions towards their internal communities and external advice, but also importantly towards national level agencies. I think some 40% of the respondents indicated that they expect this guidance to come from the national level as well, which I think is extremely important to acknowledge, and the reason why we wanted to put you all in this panel together. So now we turn to Jan for a perspective from higher education institutions and from a specific university network, but also more broadly. Jan, what are the transformations and reflections from your side?
Yeah, thank you, Irina. Thank you very much for this invitation. First of all, so when we were created in 2016, soon after that, as a network, soon after that, Brexit happened, then Donald Trump got elected. And so in our first position paper in early 2017, looking towards the next framework program, we made a really strong case for the importance of universities as part of the fabric of society and of our democracy. And so I thought what Vanessa was just saying earlier on about the importance of the strategy for universities that recognizes universities as central to the European project. I think the importance of that cannot be overstated. And so I really welcome that very strongly. So I would urge us all to take up this opportunity of this strategy to think not just about how we can change or how we can have common discussions about how we need change, but to really think about our position as part of Europe. So thank you very much for that, Vanessa. At the same time, beyond these very important goals of that strategy, we are, of course, in the middle of still huge amounts of uncertainty in institutions. And so a lot of our time at the moment is still focused on trying to make things work. And therefore, I think it is, again, really important to not forget the future and to forget the strategic question. Now is exactly the time to address these. And so on the points that you mentioned, I think that already before the pandemic, a number of institutions started to think about new ways of travel, new kinds of travel policies. And one of the things that I think we need to learn from this pandemic is, and about the future, is how we travel better, how we travel more consciously. So I think many institutions are already asking staff, for instance, to think about which one or two travel, which one or two sort of travel projects do you really need to have, and are others really necessary? And these are conversations that are beginning. They're not always easy conversations, but I do think they're necessary. And one of the, and so if we think about Erasmus, and I was really grateful for previous contributions, I also share this view that the physical mobility is absolutely essential. It still needs to be at the core of Erasmus without any question. But we do need to think about the digital in new ways. And so I do think that, the physical is, of course, critical for relationships, for cultural competences, for languages, but to really think through how this can be enhanced digitally in the light of the experience that we've all made over the past 18 months. So, and especially when we think about shorter mobility periods, how can we enhance those experiences digitally so that we really maximize the pedagogical and intercultural and linguistic value of those opportunities. So I think we need to think about, so I welcome all these ideas about doing mobility in new ways. I think that there is still a question, of course, about travel, and they're still flying, and I welcome the sort of incentives for greener travel in future. I think there's also a question of whether flying should be at all supported for distances of less, I don't know, than 1,000 kilometers or whatever. There might always be exceptions, but you can think about ways of engaging with that. And I also think about one thing we have learned, as I said, is of course the students need to travel to where they're going, but maybe staff need to travel just a little bit less to have that conversation about how the exchange is going to work or how modalities are going to function. So I do think there's a lot of work that we can do around the Erasmus, around the functioning of Erasmus, that can make Erasmus greener and more sustainable. But one of the things that I really wanted to take up finally is the point made at the very beginning by your president, Irina, about the need for data. And I really passionately believe that we need much better data to really know what works in mobility, especially when it comes to digital mobility. So if I have a classroom co-taught across the European University Network, does it actually enhance the value of students? And if so, how? How is that better than just having a class taught on a single campus? And what I would, if there's, well, I have many wishes for European universities, but one of the things I would encourage the Commission to do is maybe to encourage these European university networks, not just to try out new things, but also to really collect a robust evidence base and to really gather data about all the new things they're doing, to really then feed back in a really neutral way what works and what doesn't. And because the beauty of that would also be that they wouldn't be penalized if something doesn't work. That's the whole point of trying something out. But as long as they have the evidence base to say why something worked and why something didn't, so that after a few years we really can be much smarter about the ways in which we bring green, digital and inclusion together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, as well, for these points that I think really resonate very well with some of the key messages we're also delivering through our own position paper. And as a broader comment, what I found particularly interesting in these consultation meetings towards the strategy, and you've been part of those, and I don't know if you share this point or not, is this actual high level of agreement, I think, between us as different types of stakeholder organizations on some of the key ideas and guiding principles of these wider innovations and transformations that we aim to have through this strategy and part of our sector. And at the same time, I think sharing some of the critical reflections and some of the areas we acknowledge we need to work on as a sector and together with the European Commission. So thank you very much for those points, and also for the call for data, because what we find quite often also from our own work is that in fact there is much more data there available than we tend to think it is, but the potential, it's not yet exploited, if I can call it that way, to its full potential. So glad to hear you share this point as well, and yeah, hope to see some developments in that respect as well. Before turning to our remaining two panelists for the first round of questions, I wanted to warmly encourage those watching us online to start feeding us questions through the online platform. We'll have time for taking up questions in the audience very soon, as well as for those joining us here in the audience to think of some questions as well, or comments you would like to make as we're soon approaching that time in the program. Now, though, let's go to Prague, to Czech Republic. And hear some perspectives from Jakub as well on the same guiding question.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, when I speak about the impact of the new policy on the work of our organization, if I start with that, so I must say that the impact is huge, because we certainly refocused and actually grouped our activities a lot around these new priorities. And I must say that it's kind of, we try to get these priorities really into the heart of the organization and of the work of the organization and activities. So basically in everything that we do, it's kind of the idea that we must think it from the perspective if it's inclusive, if it's sustainable, if you know, there's digitalization possible in that. So that's something that becomes it should become the natural part, of the work of organization, or thinking, or the culture of the organization. Something what actually helped this development is that we already had CSR strategy developed before the new priorities were actually announced, and the strategy was very much in line. So now I think the good thing is that our internal strategy and the European priorities are very much in line, and also they are in line with national priorities, because, for example, inclusion is one of 2 top priorities of the Czech strategy for education in general. So I'm really glad that we kind of coming, on the same board, heading the same direction. If we talk to universities, higher education institutions, they also welcome this development, and they see a lot of potential for more flexible programs, offering a broader variety. On the other hand, it increases the complexity of the programs, complexity of the administration, because the broader variety, of course, is demanding for institutions in regards of development and support the academics. So it needs a lot of investment and a lot of thinking and a lot of actually resources dedicated to the development of these new formats and these new innovative approaches. And if I mention things on the other hand, what's on the other hand, what's may be the things that we need to deal with, as we know that the objectives, inclusiveness, sustainability, and digitalization are not new. They've been here for years. On the other hand, they've been here, kind of on the periphery. So we focus on something, and it was nice to have programs that, or activities that were digital or inclusive and so on. Now they moved much more to the center. As I mentioned, it becomes, part of the heart of the culture. And when I look at it from this side, we, of course, when we approach it this way, we open a new gate or new doors to a very new territory. And actually, Vidar spoke about it. There's a lot of unknown still. So I think that we are just learning, and the institutions are learning how to handle it. So we welcome it, and institutions think this is great, but they still struggle, how to find the solutions, how to use it the most efficient way. And so now, now we are in the process of discovering these new, bigger, and very complex territories. And on the way, we find out that we need to clarify many things. Not many things are actually clear already. So, for example, if we look at the inclusiveness, we go to very concrete points. How to, for example, identify or have processes how to self-identify the students with fewer opportunities. So the devil is in the detail in many ways. And so this is, for example, inclusiveness, the example from inclusiveness. There was already the dimension of quality assurance, how to provide quality programs when they digital, when they online, how to measure the quality, how to compare it, with the programs that are physical. And also that's a big challenge, for example, for the accreditation body, the national accreditation body, how to deal with the issue of the new formats. So it's not always that the whole system is prepared for these new novel and innovative programs. And also there may be some national legislation, like in every new program. Sometimes there are some lacking things that are lacking behind. So for example, the financial scheme, how the staff of universities is paid, don't necessarily allow them to receive bigger funding for green travel. So that when we in that kind of the new territory, we kind of coming to these things that we never thought about, and we need to overcome them. We need to solve this, to move forward. So just maybe to sum it up, I would say that we are currently in the role of explorers who are mapping the territory to find out how to reach these new policy objectives. We already have the compass. We already have the goal. We have the direction where we should go. But there's still many things that needs to be solved. There are still tools that need to be developed and invented, to use the full potential of what the current programs are offering. And the potential is really great, and I think it's really a huge impetus for innovation. So we must be innovative. Higher education institutions must be innovative, and this all also resonates what I think Vidar or Irina actually said about the guidance. That higher education institutions are asking us as a national agency for guidance. Okay, we want to do this blended intensive programs, but we still need maybe more details on how. Also, it would be great if sometimes the communication from European Commission would be clear. So there are some things that sometimes we need to work together to make things clearer, to make things the way that people can really use the tools that they are offered. So I think that we can reach these new policy objectives in the breadth and depth, but it will take some time, and there are some challenges that we need to deal with.
Thank you very much, Jakub, as well, for these reflections. And I found it particularly interesting what you highlighted on the wider objectives as such, which I fully agree with you. They're not new in a sense, right? We've been talking about inclusion. We've been talking about digitalization, sustainability for a while. What's probably new is, as you said it as well, is the centrality of these objectives, right? How important they've become in the past 2 years. And while this pandemic has made us all, I think, a bit more resilient and comfortable with dealing with uncertainties, as many remain, you've pointed that yourself. At the same time, our next big challenge and probably adventure we need to embark on is really on the operationalization of these objectives. And in answering the many pertinent questions that you highlighted as well in your intervention. Now, moving on, though, to our final panelist for this first round of questions. Juan Rayon here, we've left you deliberately at the end for some critical reflections on some of the points we've heard from the colleagues so far, and obviously hearing how this all sounds from a student perspective.
Thank you, Irina. I'm very glad to be here. It's my very first physical event as president, so it's an honor, because I really appreciate the work you do in ACA, and thank you to all the panelists. It has been fascinating to listen to your inputs. From the ESM perspective, we are totally aligned with the priorities of the new program. We really believe that inclusion, digitalization, and the greening of the program are fundamental, and they totally align with our key priorities for mobility, which are two: more mobility and better mobility. It's that easy for us. How are they connected? Very easy. Inclusion is the most important thing here. After 10 years of cooperation in education, we know that only 13.9% of European graduates have actually participated in learning mobility across Europe. We need to be more ambitious. For Norway, they were talking about a 50% target for mobility for the next 10 years. Maybe we can also have a discussion about this in the European framework. We do not have a target for mobility for the next 10 years yet, and as ESN, we believe this is very important. And I know that I'm talking to the converted, let's say, here, because ACA members are the ones pushing for big mobility targets. I'm thinking about Germany, the Netherlands, and many other countries that are doing a remarkable job in that regard. When it comes to the digital part of the program, it's all about making it easier for people to participate in mobility. Students still face many tools to access mobility due to the process. I believe we're on the right path. In a couple of weeks, the next Erasmus Plus app will be released. We really appreciate the involvement that the Commission has given to us with all the feedback and all the consultations, and the same for all the digital tools. And we should also see digitalization as a tool to improve internationalization. I don't see digital mobility as an end in and of itself, but as a way to introduce students to international environments so they can later engage in real physical mobilities. And then finally, when it comes to the greening part, for us, this is really about improving the impact of the mobility experience. This is really about making the mobility experience transformative. We have a great opportunity to every year convince almost 500,000 European students going abroad that they can acquire the right green skills to be better aware on how to take care of the environment. And the Erasmus Plus program is the right place to achieve that because we have the tools. We have cooperation projects, we have many spaces, community engagement initiatives that are fundamental for ESN, so we can also contribute to society while the students learn, are a great tool to do that. When it comes to the changes from our side, we're really trying to follow the priorities across the board. We operate in 3 levels. Most of our big European projects are now connected to inclusion, digitalization, and greening. We have the social inclusion and engagement in mobility project. We have the Green Erasmus project, and we really want to get the right inputs and all the right information, the right data from the students, so we can know which behaviors we can change and how we can make an impact, so more students participate in mobility, more students overcome the barriers that they face, but also to see how we can change the behaviors and attitudes of the students during their mobility experiences. And we're also seeing, and we really appreciate this, from the whole sector, a huge level of awareness about all the topics. We are constantly getting approached by universities, by organizations like ACA, by the European Commission to give our perspective about these topics. For us, in the end, the grassroots level impact is the most important thing. We need to be active on the ground with the students to help them to overcome the challenge and to help them to acquire the skills. And then, when it comes to some of the things that we can upscale, I believe that the new strategy for universities is a great opportunity to identify success stories and practices that have worked across Europe, and we have many of them, and especially coming from ACA members, you're doing so many things that other universities and funding organizations need to learn about. This strategy can be the right place to identify that, also connected with better synergies between EU funding sources. We've been talking for some years about the importance not only of the cooperation between Horizon Europe and Erasmus, but also structural funds for the inclusion dimension, which can be a very important and useful tool to better balance mobility flows around Europe. But for sure, we should also be honest here. National contribution is fundamental. We cannot achieve real change if national governments do not also contribute to mobility budgets. It's just not possible. This is the main reason of the divergence that we're seeing across Europe now. Then, when it comes to the role of virtual learning in general, what we believe from the Erasmus Student Network is that blended intensive courses and in general the whole digital tools can really help us to get the students into mobility. So we should not only see these tools as an objective, like a student participating in a blended mobility is good enough. We should think about how we can use blended intensive courses to convince the students to then participate in long-term mobilities. Not only Erasmus, it can also be Erasmus Mundus courses. It can also be studying abroad in a later stage, but we should really have a lifelong learning perspective from that side. And then the collaboration with stakeholders, it's absolutely critical for both the inclusion and the greening dimension. We were talking about lifelong learning and impact before. When we talk about inclusion, efforts should start at the university, but they should never finish at the university. We should better collaborate with local schools, local governments, youth workers, and many other relevant stakeholders that can help us to convince people to go abroad. Because when we talk about inclusion, we're not only talking about barriers related to backgrounds, we're also talking about attitudinal barriers of people who do not feel that mobility is also for them. And then, regarding the greening part, for us in ESN, this is really about community engagement. We want, I think we all agree here, we want mobilities to contribute to society, to be impactful. I was very glad when the fellow speakers were talking about this part. We can make a difference, and we know in ESN we have researching about the topic of the impact of mobilities for almost 25 years now. And we know it. We know that the students are eager to contribute. Universities can act as the links between international students and local communities so they can contribute with local NGOs to address local challenges that have a global dimension. If we do this, we can be very, very successful. So these are some of our main keys. As a food for thought, my main reflection is it's time to be ambitious. After Corona, we're seeing that students and societies at large really value mobility, really value freedom of movement. Let's look for a target. Let's look for more synergies. Let's have this integrated approach so we can tackle all these challenges together. That's a good part of being the last one, right?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Juan Rayon. There's been applause here in the room for those of you watching us online. Very powerful message, very, very powerful message about how ESN sees these developments and the call to be ambitious and innovative, which I understand is shared by some of the colleagues in the panel as well, and I think for all of us as a field. A clear key message, more mobility, better mobility, right? You've said it yourself, Juan Rayon, and ultimately I think that's what we're striving for also with this conversation today and wider developments. Now we've finally gotten to the point of taking some questions from the audience members, and we've been receiving comments and suggestions also in the online platform. As we start picking up on some of those, I want to invite also the colleagues here in the room in case they want to make comments or raise questions to head towards the microphone here on site. And we'll start with maybe combined questions for the European Commission colleagues. There are some questions related to future planning on inclusion and the green travel. And the question about inclusion from Elena Nielsen is, for example, if the Erasmus Plus program will introduce a green gender equality plan, as we see in other EU programs in the future. And there are also some questions from other colleagues related to plans for marketing and promoting green travel opportunities from the European Commission's point of view. And we have an example from a colleague in Greece, I think, that says the Erasmus program proposes carpooling as a green method of travel, and whether, yes, European Commission considers it a good idea, knowing that, yes, all other ways of traveling are market regulated and driven by different licensed professionals. So maybe just some first really short comments on that. Filip, from you, and also turning to Vanessa in case she's still with us in the session.
Yes, thank you. Should I just shoot off, and then maybe I'm sure
yes.
Vanessa can complement. Just to say a bit
Yes,
that honestly, I mean, we have been reflecting, I think, long and hard on how to make the Erasmus program greener, in the sense that it's all about, we heard it, physical mobility. Yet, I think, indeed, there are a lot of good examples on, for example, carpooling, on giving a bit of a top-up for students using trains instead of airplanes, for example. I think we have also incorporated what we call Discovery U, which is a bit the Interrail idea, into the Erasmus Plus program as a fully fledged action. So I think we are really trying to divert the attention actively and promoting the use of more sustainable means of transportation. And I think it's also linked with 2021 being the European Year of Trains. So that also there we make the link, and we try to promote more sustainable means of transportation. Sorry, I'm sure that Vanessa might add as well, and maybe also touch upon the gender equality plans.
Yes, Vanessa.
Thanks a lot, Filip. No, you already said everything I wanted to say regarding the promotion of greener transport, and so I think you covered it all. And of course, it's not only the Commission, but we are supported with our voices at national level, which are the Erasmus Plus national agencies putting in place all their inclusion strategy, and of course, it's part of that. I would like also to mention that with the new program, we have revisited the Erasmus Charter for higher education, which is the commitment of all higher education institutions to implement the mobilities, but also the cooperation projects. And here there is a clear commitment in terms of making the mobility greener. So I think all this together, and with what Filip mentioned, will contribute to addressing these important objectives. Now, in terms of the gender equality plan, indeed, this is a very important point that we aim to address in the European strategy for universities under a specific inclusion building block. We are not yet there when it comes to gender equality on many different fronts, including in leadership positions, but also taking into account gender equality when it comes to different disciplines and training, teaching, gender equality needs to be taken into account in the career development of both academics and researchers. So this is definitely a field where we will work closely with our colleagues from DG Research Innovation when talking about synergies at policy levels. So all this indeed is under the planning. And I think it's important, and I will maybe anticipate one of your question, Irina, which is about the importance of looking at all these key priorities, inclusion, sustainability and digitalization in a very holistic way and not independently from each other. And I would like to mention that at European level, we work very closely with our colleagues from DG Connect, or from DG Research Innovation, or from DG Environment and Clima, or DG Justice to address all these different important priorities together. And of course, the same should happen at national level and also at the institutional level, of course. But we need to start at European level.
And on that point, Vanessa and Filip, just sharing some insights again from the online participants, and we understand there's great agreement with, I think, a point you've made, Jakub, in your intervention on the importance of these guidance tools and the role that the EU and specifically the European Commission, I think, also through this strategy can actually play in this direction to provide this comprehensive framework for more joint comprehensive action. And there's also high agreement with the importance of having more evidence and more impact, which again I know it's a topic of interest within the European Commission proper, and a topic on which we can certainly provide more input as an organization and as a field. I'd like to take on maybe still one question from Sonia Mikeska, who's actually broken the ice with the online questions, and who asked about how can universities best prepare for a hybrid blended future. And I turn to you, Jan, first, perhaps, with an answer on this question from the perspective of your own members as well. What are the preparations for this hybrid future?
So I think the preparations have been ongoing for the last 18 months, really. I mean, they've been going on for longer, but now we read in a fully digital world, and Irina, to connect this to a point you were making about the evidence base being there. It's one of the things I think we need to do over the next 18 months. Is to push back a little against this idea of, well, we have to go back to the old ways of doing things because that's what I'm comfortable with, and really push our colleagues to really engage with the evidence base that we have from that experience. Not everything has been perfect, but not everything has been a disaster, and to really think what works and what doesn't. Allow me just to take up one point, though, about the impassioned words from Juan Rayon about the societal relevance and importance of Erasmus, and I completely agree. But I just wanted to remind us that so when I was a teacher, and when I had my professor, and I still am a professor, but when I taught so many students who've been on Erasmus, and the reason why I'm such an impassioned fan of Erasmus is that the students, I mean, without fail, they came back, and their minds were broadened, their ways of thinking were transformed, in addition to the intercultural experiences they've had. So this has been an intellectual experience that we could not have given them had they just stayed at our institution. And so I would really urge us, when we think about Erasmus in the future, to really think about this in the round, and of course this is what this event is about. So if we want to emphasize the societal dimension, which I think is right, because all of our universities are engaging more and more in their communities around them, we shouldn't forget the intellectual experience that they have in their courses, and this challenge that they're overcoming about mastering completely different ways of arguing, thinking, and expressing themselves. And that you cannot do, say, for instance, in a short Erasmus, if you make these days short and shorter, you can probably do one or the other, but you can't do both. So we really do need to think also about, as we think about more different ways of doing things, we need to be very clear about what is it that we're gaining and what is it that we're losing. And that's not to say that we can only have one, but it's just really a plea for being really conscious about what it is that we're combining and moving into. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jan, for this reflection also, and just to share a further thought. In fact, when we were planning this event and thinking of this idea of comprehensive approaches, that's precisely also what we had in mind, that probably the future of mobility will be a mixed portfolio, right, where different types are being combined, and they're probably leading to different outcomes that ideally, at institution level, then at system level, will be complementary to each other and will form a self-standing portfolio of activities as you wish, and as will be supported by more evidence of impact in all these dimensions, and how different formats might be actually fitting for different purposes, but complementary purposes, we hope. Looking now also at the time and realizing we're very close to having to wrap up the panel, I would like to actually invite you to make some final, very brief remarks on how to concretely actually work towards the synergies at policy and at practice level and develop more comprehensive approaches. I think everybody has already touched upon that a bit through their interventions. What I'm looking for now is a bit of a summary, if you wish, on some key words of advice in 1 minute for each of you. So let's start with Juan Rayon here on the panel, okay. Giving you the floor to...
Thank you so much, Ilya. From our side, two key things to keep in mind. Access and impact. That's the main summary. We need to use the new priorities to focus on access, how we can help students to participate in mobility, how you were talking about different tools, I totally agree, how we can use the increasing toolbox that we have in the internationalization sector to approach mobility in a complementary way, connecting students through European University Alliances, the importance of blended learning as a pathway towards long-term mobility, etc. And then impact, academic impact, impact on society, collaboration with stakeholders, trying to make mobility experiences as good as possible. If we see the three priorities aligned with these two key elements, we will be very successful.
All right, thank you. So 2 keywords already, access and impact. And then we move to Jakub for some further reflections on this.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have several points. I hope I'll try to keep them brief. First is communication. I think we really need to communicate top down and bottom up, to come with solutions, because, sometimes we have some blind spots that we don't see, and we should not really forget about identification of the side effects at these blind spots, and sometimes from the strategic perspective, we don't see the blind spots if they see it on the ground, and it must be reflected. So all this, top down, all this like flow of communication and information is very important. The other thing, what I really believe is really cooperation, in a sense of, sharing, because there are a lot of very good practices already in Europe, so it's really, to find time and provide platforms that we can share these good practice, so they can spread out and people don't have to invent the wheel again and again. The other would be really training, because I think it's really, if universities and agencies, we want to come with some solution, we must really build capacities. So, and actually Erasmus has a lot of great tools, because Erasmus, of course, is not just about mobility. We have KA2 Key Action 2 programs, so there are projects that are developed and they are shared. We have TCA activities, so try to look at these, training and capacity building activities within Erasmus or even outside Erasmus, whatever's available. For example, we have national program that supports digitalization, so take a look at these opportunities and use them. And the last, and this would be probably, I would be repetitive in this, but I think it's very important. I think it's really important to regularly analyze the impact. And you already talked about data collection, and feedback. We still need feedback, and we need to react to that feedback. So again, that's that information. Okay, we did this, what it impacted, and do we know it? And if the impact wasn't that we intended, let's change how we did it. So that this really, this feedback and analysis are very, very crucial. But it's been already said by my predecessors. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jakub, as well. So communication, cooperation, training, and impact more generally in feedback loops. Moving to Norway now, to Vidar for some additional thoughts as well, very briefly.
Thank you, Irina, and thanks to for all the interventions that have been here. Very, very inspiring indeed. I think we should, in a way, recognize that there are certain tensions between the goals set up here. There is an obvious a tension between mass mobility and greening and sustainability. There might even be a tension between digitalization and inclusiveness, to be honest, because well, digital means can include more students, but there's already a digital divide that needs to be bridged first, perhaps, in terms of access to equipment and good broadband connections and so forth. But tensions between goals does not necessarily mean that they are mutually exclusive. Rather, it means that we need to strike a balance between them. And I think that is the work that needs to be focused on. How can you achieve all these goals, and what would be the correct measures, what would be correct extent of different measures to achieve these goals? And I think the best way to do that is to continue to work in close partnerships between funding agencies, but also between universities, to solve these challenges together. Everybody agrees we need physical mobility, and I think everybody also realizes that more travel means an increased carbon footprint, but that can be offset in other ways. So there's always a question of striking the balance. And I think as we're now slowly moving out of the pandemic, we have learned a lot, and some of these lessons will need to be carried on so that, as I think it was Jana said, we should not go back to the world as it was prior to March 2018. There are many lessons learned, and it's important to see that we bring forth the good things that we've learned in the future, combining them with what was also possible in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Vidar, as well, for this real tour de force. And now turning to Vanessa, and then to Jan, and last but not least to Filip here on site for final reflections.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting words and key messages already said. If I want to add to that, I would say build bridges. Build bridges between our policies and between our instruments at all levels, European, national and institutional level. As you said, absolutely, Vidar, if we want to see digitalization or to see more developing what works in terms of digitalization, it requires more IT infrastructure, but it requires as well to make it as inclusive as possible, that this complementary format of learning teaching are devised and developed having purpose to make them inclusive. So when we say the development of short learning courses or micro-credentials can help to make learning teaching more inclusive to a wider range of learners, yes, provided that they are developed especially for that particular purpose and for that particular target group. So it's not a magical tool. And for that, we need, as you said, Jakub, training and capacity building. And also sharing experiences, as you said, Jan, before, evidence and data, and sharing these practices, what works and what does not work. So build bridges, sharing evidence and data, and training capacity building. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Vanessa. And now to Jan.
Just one sentence in the light of time, and lots of I agree really with everything that's been said by way of summary. The one sentence is that I think we shouldn't take the engagement support of states for granted. So I think we really also need to work with member states. Populists are on the rise in many parts of Europe, and they do not take the success of Erasmus for granted or its purpose. And that's why we need, again, the European strategy for universities, because we really need Europe to push also in collaboration with the member states for so that we really work in partnership at institutional, national, regional, and European level.
Great reminder, Jan, as well, that we've also transitioned a period of increasing populism and critical attitudes toward internationalization in general. And perhaps we're a bit in the group of the convinced now, when we need to be thinking beyond and acting beyond. Filip, final words from you.
Okay, thanks. I indeed agree to a lot what has been said. I think it's very relevant to, although we all agree to the green, digital and inclusiveness as key priorities, we need to be very much aware that it's not excluded that there are tensions between them. I feel particularly concerned by this because it does exist between European member states, but I think the tensions are maybe even greater when we look at international mobility beyond. When we talk about green travel, it's a bit more complicated further afield. When we talk about inclusion, even on having a good understanding of what it means, people with fewer opportunities is a bit of a challenge when you work in a very intercultural setting and with countries with very different standards of living. And also the digitalization, it was already a big issue between European countries. You can imagine that further afield, it's even a bigger challenge. So I think the potential tensions are even bigger when we talk about international mobility beyond EU borders. But I agree to a lot what has been said in the sense of trying to find a balance. So we cannot ignore that there might be tensions, but seeing how can we solve them and how can we find the right balance. As said, to tap into the good practices, I think there's a lot of experience out there that we can use and replicate. And I think a final point is that something that we will reflect upon as well, and that I think you might see more and more, is the whole concept of a Team Europe approach. We'll be looking at what is happening at member states, what member states are doing, what their priorities are, what means and tools they put into mobility and cooperation beyond EU borders, and how we can link, have synergies, and try to leverage on the combined impact of member states' actions and EU action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. In fact, warm thanks to the 6 of you for these very rich contributions in this first panel today. I'm highly grateful for all your insights. You've also made my task of summarizing this session a bit of mission impossible, but I think that's a luxury problem to have. As time is short, I'd like to wrap up by saying that I think ultimately we agree on that there's still a great opportunity to co-shape this the development of the European strategy for universities, and there's still some ample room to contribute to the development of the strategy. Great confirmation also, I think, through the discussions that this question or new dimension of synergies between pillars is extremely important, and we need to address it as a sector within the strategy as well. That we shouldn't shy away from acknowledging some of these tensions, but also work together in overcoming them and also striking a balance ultimately, working towards more and better mobility. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you very much for your attention. We're already into the coffee break, and we'll be back at 11:15 for the continuation of the program. Next panel will be chaired by Ragnhild Solviberg. Enjoy the coffee break and see you back very shortly.